guest today is Fiona Tinwei Lam.
Hello.
And she has just been appointed, is that the right word?
Yes, it is exactly the right word.
Vancouver's 6th Poet Laureate. Now, Fiona, there is so much I need to ask you, but first, let me say that Fiona responded to one of our e-newsletters very recently and explained who she was and said that she'd been coming to our concerts for a number of years. And it really is a number of years because you obviously heard Lang Lang in his Vancouver debut at the Playhouse, which was 5,000 million years ago. I never even looked up the date that it took place, but and that you've been following the VRS, and now that you were the Poet Laureate, if I had any ideas of poetry and music. So the next thing I did was I looked her up. And my God, Fiona, you are one of the most fascinating people I've ever come across. So can we start at the beginning, please? I see that you were born in Scotland.
That's right. My mother and father were both born in Hong Kong, and they didn't know each other back then. They both studied in mainland China as well. My dad who was not so musical. He came from a family that had worked itself up through the peasantry and so forth into solid middle classdom. And the family was of civil engineers. And of course, they wanted their sons to be doctors. And so he didn't really necessarily want to be a doctor, but he did what his parents told them to do. And he went and studied in the States. But back then, there was the revolution going on in China. And so he said, family capitalists, I'm going to China. So he went off to China, and because he was the son of a capitalist, he wasn't treated so well, shall we say. And he got very, very ill. He was sent to work in the countryside, and he became very, very ill. He had to be smuggled out and came back to Hong Kong, where he was reviled because he had been supporting the communists, and they sent him off to Scotland. Get him out of the trouble, out of the way. He was the son who had done wrong, and they sent him there, far, far in the Commonwealth, of course. And there he met my mother. My mother, who didn't know his family or him at all, she was training as a physician as well in obstetrics. And she had a car, and she knew the town, so she befriended him and showed him around, and they became a couple. And I was born there, and I had a thick Scottish accent, I'm told.
Oh my God!
That you can see is not apparent anymore. And my sister was born there. That's why my name is Fiona. It's not a made-up name. It's on my birth certificate. Born in Paisley. And Fiona was the name that they chose, along as Tinwei, which is the word for heavenly wisdom, or intuitive knowledge, which is a big name to live up to. And then we came over, yes, to Canada when I was 4 years old. But my mom, it's interesting, music was her solace. It was her source of expression. And because she'd been a physician, and a very respected physician in Scotland, she'd been there for over 10 years working, but she was a mom with young children when she came over, and she wasn't accredited as a doctor. And there were some in-laws that didn't want her to be practicing as a doctor, so she would express herself through music. And in Scotland, at first, she started out with she knew piano from times in the war. They had an old player piano in her household, and she learned on the player piano, and she had some music lessons. And then she studied in the UK as well, and she couldn't afford a piano as a med student, so she learned the accordion. And then she'd go to music stores in Glasgow, and she would play in the music stores so she could play the piano. And when they came to Canada, because of her frustrations, she played a lot of Chopin and Beethoven, a lot of very heavy, dense Chopin and Beethoven to express her frustration of not being allowed to be a doctor while we were young. And then we all had piano lessons, my sister, my brother, and I. And we grew up listening to her play and with lessons. And my father wasn't a big fan of classical music. He would leave the house when he played because she was telling him something with the music.
Yeah.
But after he passed away, she was grieving, and she played a lot of music expressing grief. But because my mother sort of took the space with the piano, I played a little bit and not very well. I didn't practice so much. I wasn't one of those whiz kids like Lang Lang or anyone like that, although I admire them very much. I took to writing poetry. That was my manner of expression. And
so how old were you when you started writing poetry?
Oh, I was very young. My mom sang nursery rhymes and sang nursery songs to me in English because she wanted to make sure that our English would be pristine from when we were very, very young. But I remember my first poem being in grade 2, and the teacher really liked it. I was just experimenting with rhyme and having fun with words, and she loved it so much. She made me write it in felt pen on a big piece of paper and put it up on the bulletin board in the hallway. And I just thought, wow, this is amazing. And I didn't look back from that point on. I thought, oh, it looks like people seem to like my poetry. And I discovered free verse in grade 7 by looking in the back of my mom's women's magazines. I was like, this isn't a rhyme. Oh, I guess I can try that. And in high school, of course, there was learning about Shakespeare and Keats and Tennyson and so forth. But then I became a lawyer after 4 years of political science, feeling that poetry wasn't going to be a legitimate career.
But where did you study political science? At UBC or?
Yes, at UBC.
Right.
And a great political science department, great professors, very interesting. But I really missed writing poetry, and it took me a long time to go through political science, go through a law degree, and then go through another law degree, a master's of law at U of T, after doing the bachelor's of law at Queen's in Kingston, to suddenly realize after a few more steps, I had to article and work in a large law firm and work at the Law Society, and I even taught law. And each time it was going further and further away. It's like that game, where they go cold, hot, and so forth to what your heart wants. And so it took a lot of getting colder and colder and colder until I decided that it was time to do what I really wanted to do, and that was to write. And then I did a Master's of Fine Arts at UBC. And from then on, I published books of poetry and didn't look back.
While you were practicing law, or while you were studying law and all these other things, did you try to write poetry on the side? Or did you just say, no, I have this life now and I'll go to poetry another time?
I'm one of those people that needs to really dive deep to immerse myself in whatever I'm doing in order to do it well. So I'd say, sure, I wrote a couple of bad poems along the way, but there's nothing like immersing yourself, because I think just like a musician would be affected by what they're listening and what world they're in, the sounds and so forth. I think in the legal world, you're listening to words that are used a certain way, and it's stock phrases, certain kinds of metaphors. You're trying to lock down something in a contract or fight over the interpretation of what is a motor vehicle, for example.
Yes.
That kind of thing. And it's fighting over words for monetary purposes. Unless you're doing criminal law, of course, then you're fighting over big stakes, incarceration or not. And I really wanted to find words to take me into beauty and wonder and delight and discovery that had nothing to do with the financial world and fighting over money. And I wanted to express a lot of things that weren't going to be expressed legally. Of course, people can express their grief legally, but that's a very expensive way to fight over money, over a will or an estate. And of course, they can fight in family law, as we all know, in nasty ways. But why not go to the beginning and the origins of those feelings? I think if more people wrote poetry about what they were feeling, the traumas, the concerns, they would actually, it would have a therapeutic influence and resolve a lot of what feeds conflict.
There's so many things that go through my head as I listen to you speak. Now, as I think I mentioned, my husband taught law at UBC almost in prehistoric times. I mean, I think he joined the faculty in 1962, and he was educated in South Africa and then in England, and he went to Harvard for a year. He has a gift of language, and he's always been a very good speaker, teacher, writer. And I remember, so I only came onto the scene in 1966, but I do remember for many years while he was teaching, because as you know, a law degree in Canada, you come into it after you've already done another degree. And
Exactly.
he was at the time appalled at how poorly the students who came to the law school wrote. He said they couldn't put together sentences properly. There seemed to be so little emphasis on good writing. And to make a good argument, I would imagine you have to have a certain kind of a brain and you have to be able to write. And I can't for 1 second imagine what it must be like in today's world where everything is on computers and everything is quick, whether people's writing capacities in general in the lives in which their careers are built are actually deteriorating.
I think partly nowadays with law school, people are entering law school from business school, from other areas, not from the liberal arts. I feel like that there's a decline in people coming from the liberal arts into law. And I think if they know a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of literature, they'll have a better understanding of language. I think it's the devaluation of literature that has led to this problem now.
Let me ask you, how do you become the Poet Laureate? And then there's another question, because I read about you on the Tyee, and the word laureate. Please explain how that comes about, because it's so fascinating.
Yes, because some people have been scratching their heads, what is this Poet Laureate thing? And of course, the word laureate comes from the word laurel, which comes from the tree. And so why is this tree particularly important? Well, there's the great myth, the Greek myths of Apollo and Daphne. Apollo, god of the sun, music, poetry, archery, and many, many other things. He was in hot pursuit of poor Daphne. Daphne, who was sworn to chastity. She loved being in the forest. She was a naiad nymph of streams and brooks and so forth, and a fan of Artemis, not into men and not into Apollo. Didn't matter how good looking he was and how powerful and charismatic he might have been. Supposedly Cupid had been angry with Apollo, shot him with one of the arrows. So Apollo was totally, totally smitten. Or you could say he was a stalker. I mean, there's two ways of looking at it, but he was obsessed. And he pursued Daphne to her wit's end. And finally, she just was about to be seized for Apollo's purposes. And she cried out to her father, the river god Peneus, and said, "Dad, help me, help me. Apollo is about to get me." And so he helped her by turning her into a laurel tree, evergreen, beautiful laurel tree. And Apollo was quite unhappy about this, but he revered the tree forevermore, and he vowed that he would honor the tree and honor Daphne's memory and his love for her by bestowing the leaf upon anyone he wished to honor. So athletes, of course, we think of athletes with the laurel crown on their heads, and musicians, as well as poets. And so there's a poet laureate of Canada, of course, and then there's different small poet laureates in different cities. England, of course, has a poet laureate from the 1600s. John Dryden was the first royal poet laureate that was funded by the royal office. And Canada had its first poet laureate in 2002 with George Bowering. And right now it's Louise Bernice Half, who's an Aboriginal First Nations poet. And we've had 6 poet laureates. I'm the 6th in Vancouver. Dr. Joseph Wask established the office with a grant to the Vancouver Foundation, and he asks the Vancouver City Council, the Vancouver Writers Fest, and the Vancouver Public Library to oversee this position. So I'm actually I don't have an office. I'm not paid by the city or the library. It's by Dr. Joseph Wask and his vision that poetry was important for the city to be a true cosmopolitan city. So it's thanks to him and his vision that this position has existed.
What exactly is that job description to be a poet laureate? Is there somebody who sits over you and says, well, you've got to write 64 more lines before the end of next week, otherwise you haven't done. So how does it work?
Each poet laureate, well, before they even become poets laureate, they have to put in an application. And there's a jury appointed by the 3 institutional overseers, the library, the Writers' Festival, and the cultural planners at the City Council. They choose a jury. And this jury looks at all the applications and decides whose project they like. And they liked my project. And they also wanted someone had published and was respected for their work as well. And so I'm sure there were many. I understand there were 10 candidates. I'm sure each and every one of them would have been terrific poets laureate with terrific projects. For whatever reason, they decided to choose my particular project. And my project is a poetry contest. I feel like during the pandemic, we've been stuck here in the city for most of the past 2 years. And I thought, instead of seeing the city as a kind of prison where we're trapped, see it as a source of wealth and riches and experience. So have a contest to engage everyone and anyone who's spent time within these unceded territories known as Vancouver, give them the chance to express themselves through poetry about sites of historical, cultural, and ecological interest. So it could be, for example, the Orpheum, a grand, beautiful building. It could be Nat Bailey Stadium if you're an athlete. It could be one of the parks. Stanley Park has an incredible, fascinating history of villages of Hawaiians, Portuguese, and First Nations people being evicted before it became a park. So absolutely interesting. The bridges, the marine building, so much history here.
Yes.
So why not do that? I think there's a lot of untapped potential in this city for people to express themselves through poetry, which takes being very present, being very mindful, maybe doing a little bit of research through the Vancouver Heritage Foundation's Places That Matter site or its Heritage Finder site, or the Museum of Vancouver, which has lovely artifacts and exhibits about Vancouver history, looking at a painting, looking at a photograph, tons of wonderful books about Vancouver history, and articles that are available readily online if you can't go to the library. So there's a wealth of information. You just go to the site, walk around. There's plaques and architecture and old trees, the remains of old trees, old hidden streams that are being daylighted. So I thought, we have some creative people, lots of creative people in the city, and why not encourage them with prizes to write some poems, submit the poems. There's a submission site through the Vancouver Public Library's Poet Laureate page with all the rules and information. The contest is open from now until April 15th for emerging poets, for youth, and for poets who've already published a book. It doesn't matter if they're living in Vancouver or not, as long as the poem is about some place in Vancouver, and see what emerges. That's the first stage. And then after the poems are judged and the winners and the shortlisted poems are chosen, the plan is to have a second stage where film students can compete to do poetry films and poetry videos based on those poems. And then we can have a screening and a celebration. And for those people who have difficulty with sitting there and listening to a poem, there's something about putting the words to music and to film that will transform them into a different experience. And there's so many wonderful international venues for poetry films and videos. I've done a number of poetry films and videos, and I've been amazed. It's like, wow, there's places all over the world that want to see these creative projects of 2 minutes to 3 minutes of distilled poetry with music and visuals, experimental versions, more documentary versions, animated shorts. And it's a great way to impart poetry across all kinds of boundaries.
I listened to you for 5 minutes and you open 65 million doors. And I don't know which room to enter from what you're talking about, because, okay, and I've got such a scatterbrain anyway. So let me just go back for 1 second. Let's talk about what you were suggesting, that once the poems have been written, and then there will be a video component. And of course, inevitably, music will come in somewhere to something. So
Yes.
I remember having a conversation with a wonderful young singer who is going to come to us this season after next season, all going well. She's actually Canadian born. Oh my God, her heritage has gone out of my head. But she's born and raised in Toronto, and she studied violin, and her name is Emma Nikolovska. And she's absolutely extraordinary. She's a wonderful leader singer. I mean, when she's on stage, she has that power of communication and vitality that you just have to listen to her. Now, I'm sitting here in North America, where the ritual of leader is something that is still very, very foreign to many people. It is extremely difficult to sell tickets to leader recitals. Okay. So I thought, there are so many barriers. First of all, in the old days, the singer would stand up, sing in German, whether it was Schubert or Schumann or whatever, and people would sit with their programs and they'd follow the text. We printed out in the original language and in English so that they could understand. And the singers, in essence, were singing to the top of people's heads while they were looking at the thing. Okay, so that doesn't work.
No.
So then, right, well, we're going to change. Oh, and the other thing was, and then everybody turns the page at the same time. So there's this huge. Then somebody, of course, with the opera, they came up with the idea of surtitles. Okay, if they can do that for opera, we can do that for vocal recitals. So now the next step, well, I suppose it's better to be singing to someone who's doing this than someone who's doing this. But my point is that when you have something electronic there describing what the person is mouthing on the stage with lovely music and behind her, there is a layer of a layer that comes between the audience and the person. So let's not call vocal recitals anymore. What they are is storytelling. The singer is telling a story. And forget all the crap that you have to put there to explain what's going on. Engage a singer who has that power of communication and says to the audience, look, I'm going to sing about this, this, and this for the next 15 minutes. And I have 7 songs, and this is what they're about. And then, so in other words, there's nothing between the singer and the audience. So I think we have to take a layer of stuffiness out.
I agree. I agree. You know, what's interesting is sometimes I think it's difficult to merge sometimes the music and the poetry. What I was very inspired with when I was a young, nerdy teenager, very, very nerdy, I would be sitting on this beanbag chair, and my mom had all these Reader's Digest sets of classical music albums, and I would put some on the record player and I would listen to them. And the ones that really stood out to me, I didn't realize at the time, were pieces that were inspired by poems, interestingly enough. And I think of, for example, Ravel, right? Gaspard de la Nuit.
Yes.
With, you know, Ondine, Le Gibet, so forth. And those are just, the images just pop in your head of the movements and the mood and so forth. And I didn't realize at the time it was based on a French poem. And okay, let's go into something that everybody knows. Of course, everyone knows Debussy's Clair de Lune.
Yeah.
Based on Paul Verlaine. You don't need to read Paul Verlaine's poem to experience that music, but that music was inspired by that same poem, you know, Clair de Lune. And same with Lark Rising, right? And so many other pieces. And of course, you know, Schubert had, you know, something like 600. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think music can be inspired by poetry, and poetry can be inspired by music. And I found a quote for you about poetry and music I wanted to share with you that Henry Purcell wrote in 1650. He said, "Music and poetry have ever been acknowledged sisters, which walking hand in hand support each other. As poetry is the harmony of words, so music is that of notes. And as poetry is a rise above prose and oratory, so is music the exaltation of poetry. Both of them may excel apart, but sure they are most excellent when they are joined."
Will you send that to me?
Yes.
Please. Oh, that is just fabulous.
And so when they are joined that way, it doesn't have to be, you know, through song where you hear the words. Sometimes it can be. Often it might be just maybe a line that's repeated over and over in a choral piece. But I think it's something special when it's just an instrumental, actually, that's trying to transform those very distilled words and images into sound and shaped sound. So it's all working sort of with movement and sound in different ways.
Well, of course, there's one other element, though, that you should throw into that mix as well, and that's painting.
Oh, I have something. May I share a screen with you? I have a poem, a prose poem based on a painting. I'll see if I can bring it up. So we all know about Vermeer, and he had, of course, not so many paintings that are left, but there's this wonderful painting that was stolen from a gallery in Boston, and Let's see if I can bring it up here. And it's a poem, the painting is called The Concert.
Yes.
And it looks a little faded here, I'm sure. When it would
look at that light.
Be fixed up, it would have been much more colorful and vibrant once it had been restored. But many poets write poems based on artwork or specifically paintings, and they're called ekphrastic poems, which is a fancy term for just saying poems about art. And here is the prose poem that I wrote, and I'll just read it for you. You see the women first in this room with its gleaming checkerboard tiles. The singer poised like a Renaissance Madonna, white collar and bodice lit by angled sunlight flowing through an unseen window. Her right hand caresses a rising phrase as her gaze gathers notes from a slip of music hovering over the curve of her pregnant belly. Intent at her keyboard, face in shadow, the harpsichordist's head bends as if in prayer. Follow the brushstrokes of yellow ribbon in her hair down to the golden puff of sleeve, her arms distilling sunlight. Behind the radiant axis of the women, you hardly notice the backdrop's paintings, dark windows bringing outer world into inner world. On one side, a backdrop of towering elms glowering at dusk. On the other side, a man and crone haggling over desire's vulgar purchase. And if it weren't for the red chair at the center, the white glimpse of his cuff, you'd almost miss the lute player, his head and broad shoulders like a dark hill against a bright landscape on the harpsichord's open lid, its tamed harmony of foliage and summer sky. Absorbed, he blends into music, his back to us, audience irrelevant. So I'll just bring that picture up again. And you see that picture on the harpsichord's lid and the pregnant singer there, and the yellow ribbons there, the beautiful, beautiful painting. Poetry and music, definitely sisters.
Oh, I don't know what to say now. I mean, you've just transported me, and you've taken the words away, so you better keep talking.
Okay, I'll keep talking. I want to bring everyone back down to earth because you've been transported up to Vermeer land, there, the beauty of music in art. I've also written some poems about, I mentioned my mother and her playing. She unfortunately she was a brilliant woman. She was a physician and also an artist in oil painting and Chinese watercolor painting. Of course, played the accordion and the ukulele and the pipe organ. She did grade 8 Royal Conservatory pipe organ. But she got early onset Alzheimer's as well as macular degeneration. So she had a very hard time, and she passed away after 10 years of a very slow struggle with Alzheimer's. And we miss her very, very much, and her many talents. We're all pale shadows of her in some ways. But I wrote a poem to remember her, and in a kind of a funny way, because she certainly did express herself. It's called Piano. Weekend mornings, I was a lazy Mary who never got up, despite how many fortissimo rounds of Frere Jacques my mother played. Schumann's Happy Farmers pranced next to marching saints, amazed with grace. Some nights she rolled out barrels through wild Irish roses, Chopin waltzing into Beethoven's Moonlight, the piano bench her throne over kingdoms of sound. Pulse, leap, plunge of chord, shiver and trickle of trill, stinging pinpricks of staccato, stalking octaves. Arpeggios cascading along the keyboard, conjured like rainbow scarves drawn from a magician's hat. All her spells honed, notes imprinting the air above the raised lid. Vivace, allegro, grave, doloroso. Moderato, rarely. Pianissimo, never. So that was her in a
Oh
poem.
my goodness. Oh, well, so, oh, listen, the end of this discussion that we have is just the beginning of our new connection, okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Because you just blown my mind. I mean, there are just so many things that need still to be said and looked into and discovered by both of us. But let me just go back to this competition.
Yes.
Okay. So now you choose the winners, the winner is chosen, and then there's the second stage where there's videos. So why not a third stage where composers, they're given some poems of these poems that are entered, and young composers to write music to songs to them?
I would love that. They could be occurring contemporaneously, concurrently, right? They wouldn't have to be film and then
No,
music.
exactly.
So my term is only 2 years. So that is definitely an idea. I would love to do that. I'd probably have to get funding. The funding right now that I get is going to the prizes. And I
Okay.
don't want to make the prizes any smaller, but I think
Well,
all artists would deserve to have a good prize at the end. I know that there have been some wonderful initiatives. I shared with you that 2014-2015 initiative of the Downtown East Side Writers working with UBC music composers and singers and performers to do this wonderful collection of songs that were recorded and also put into a book. That got Canada Council funding through Instruments for Change. So definitely one could look into something like that. I would love that personally.
I would say that this conversation that you and I are having, which is publicly disseminated through our wonderful e-news, is just the very beginning of many more discussions I'd like to have with you. And because I'm just so intrigued by this whole notion of your capabilities, your enthusiasm, your ability to embrace all aspects of the art. And furthermore, uh, I saw something just passed me by on television one night, and maybe it was one of the ads for one of our First Nations communities that sort of come on up on CBC or whatever channel I happen to be watching. And somebody said something about what really can bring people together is food.
Yes.
And, you know, that is stuck in my head. I mean, there is yet another element of human engagement that could break down barriers.
The last Poet Laureate did that. She went into farmers markets and read poems with a group of us. And she wrote, edited an anthology called Sustenance, which are poems all about food. And if you want food poems, I got food poems as well.
I come to this because it's part of my growing up. So I grew up in South Africa, in a white dominated apartheid South Africa. And it kind of, of course, I was lucky. My skin was white. But nevertheless, if you have any kind of a heart or a feeling inside, it really is terribly distressing to watch what's going on around. And it affects you for the rest of your life.
Absolutely.
And I was naive enough, I was stupid enough to think that when I left South Africa, I would be leaving apartheid and all this stuff behind me. Ha ha ha, little did I know. But the point I want to make is that in South Africa, with all the apartheid and with all the hideous rules and regulations, the food that people eat in South Africa is the South African dishes, the food of the nation. Is such an amalgamation of the nations who came and populated South Africa. Indonesian, Afrikaans cooking, English cooking, and it's the food in South Africa is multinational. And if it can be multinational through food, why can't we do the same thing in other parts of the world?
I think if we could share some feasts, if we had more feasts and brought everyone together,
yes,
that would be the way to do it, to create community and create those bonds, forge those bonds.
So maybe we should have festivals and festivals.
Yes, I think so.
Hey?
Poetry and music too.
Yes, but you know what? First of all, they have to build us venues in Vancouver, because that's what's sadly lacking. We need good venues, purpose-built venues. The Orpheum is a wonderful old building, but it was built as a vaudeville house. It's not good for the symphony, and it's way too big. The Queen Elizabeth Theatre is a great big bloody barn, and it's ugly. We need a hall for chamber music. We need a hall for opera and dance that's built specifically for those purposes. And then we need spaces around them so that we can eat and celebrate. And I mean, there's so much opportunity here still.
Oh, yes, full of potential.
It is, but we need some visionaries in this town, and visionaries who are willing to put their money where their mouth is.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay?
Okay, visionaries.
Calling all visionaries.
Yes.
Well, this has been extraordinary. I mean, I don't know how to begin to thank you. And
I want to thank you, Leila, for an amazing series that has brought beauty to so many. Even during the pandemic, you have worked so hard to make sure that music enters our lives through our screens. And so many of us appreciate that, your commitment to music.
Oh, listen, it's a passion. I'm very lucky. It's just, I can't help myself. I'm addicted to doing what I do. Let's hope that this meeting will lead to lots more fruitful things in the future. And you look after yourself, and we'll keep in close touch.
Yes, thanks so much again. Wonderful to talk to you.
God bless you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.